Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In 1941, North Africa became the proving ground for modern mechanized warfare. The war in Europe had settled into occupation and resistance, but in the open deserts of Libya and Egypt, the battle was still fluid, still undecided. Here, the British Empire and Nazi Germany fought not for territory alone, but for strategic dominance over the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond. The outcome of this struggle would determine whether Axis forces could sever Britain's access to oil, cripple its supply lines, and open a direct path to the vast colonial holdings of South Asia. By mid-1941, German and Italian forces under General Erwin Rommel had driven deep into British-controlled territory. With France defeated and Britain standing largely alone, Hitler saw an opportunity to seize control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, the artery of the British Empire. The forces available to stop him were outnumbered, battered, and in many cases, already exhausted from months of desert warfare. But if they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Mediterranean would fall under Axis control. The oil fields of Iraq and Iran would be cut off or seized outright. A German advance through the Middle East could have linked with the Japanese push into Burma, threatening India from two fronts. The Soviet Union, already battling for survival against the largest land invasion in history, would face a potential southern attack through the Caucasus. If these events had unfolded, the entire balance of World War II would have shifted. But they didn't. Not because of grand strategy in London or Berlin, but because of what happened next. A single defensive stand deep in the Libyan desert changed the course of the war. The men who held their ground there did not just prevent Rommel's victory. They set in motion a series of events that would lead to the eventual Axis defeat in North Africa. Let's now experience the Siege of Tobruk.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 12, The Siege of Tobruk, from the 10th of April to the 7th of December, 1941. German forces, the entire Nazi African Corps, made up of 2 German and 2 Italian divisions, quantity unknown. Allied forces, roughly 22,000 troops. British troops refused to break, grinding down the German-Italian offensive in Egypt. Their defiance did more than just slow the Axis advance. It kept them from launching a full-scale assault on Malta, the island fortress that stood between Hitler and total control of the Mediterranean.
9 months into World War II, the fires of battle spread to North Africa. Italy declared war on June 10th, 1940, and within 24 hours, British forces surged out of Egypt, hitting Italian positions with brutal efficiency and leaving their enemy bloodied before the campaign had even begun. Benito Mussolini, drunk on fantasies of empire, envisioned Italy reclaiming its ancient glory. The Mediterranean, in his mind, was not a contested sea. It was to be Italy's alone. Libya had been in Italian hands since 1912, a sun-scorched outpost of empire. From there, Mussolini plotted to seize the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields, resources that would fuel the Axis war machine. With France collapsing under the relentless advance of German forces, Britain had no reserves to send. The men already in Egypt would have to stand alone, and for now, it would be enough. British forces wasted no time. In the opening weeks, they raided relentlessly up the coastal road into Cyrenaica, setting enemy installations ablaze and dragging prisoners back across the border. Italian Marshal Rodolfo Graziani struck back on September the 13th. His 10th Army crept forward, pushing into Egypt, slow, methodical, but for now, unstoppable. And then they paused. They needed to build roads for their advance. That hesitation was all the British needed. 2 divisions counterattacked and shattered the 10th Army, wiping it from the battlefield. By February 9th, 1941, Major General Richard O'Connor had led his men to a resounding triumph. Cyrenaica was his, and the Italians had paid dearly. 130,000 casualties. Their army humiliated. With Tobruk secured, British forces wasted no time. Trenches were dug, fortifications reinforced. The port would not fall so easily. Hitler would not allow the Italians to collapse unchecked. He sent in the Germans. Leading them was General Erwin Rommel, a commander forged in fire, his ruthless armored assaults having torn through France the year before. Rommel arrived in Benghazi, took one look at the battlefield, and struck. The British were stretched thin, their best men siphoned off to fight in Greece. Rommel would not let them breathe. British forces had swept into Libya like a tide, and now that tide was in full retreat. German tanks roaring after them, grinding up the desert beneath their treads. The Western Desert Army had been mauled, its commander, General O'Connor, taken prisoner. In Cairo, General Archibald Wavell struggled to halt the relentless German advance. By mid-1941, Rommel's advance had reached the edge of Egypt, but Tobruk still stood, its defenders, Australian, British, and Indian troops, holding firm. Rommel's tanks ruled the open desert, his blitzkrieg tactics unmatched, but Tobruk was a different beast. The fortifications were deep, and the defenders unyielding. Major General Leslie Morshead of the Australian 9th Division took command as the British withdrew in disorder. What he commanded was not an army, not even a full division, just the battered defenders of Tobruk, but he would make them count. General Wavell's orders were blunt. Hold Tobruk for 2 months. By then, reinforcements would come. Morshead had no choice but to comply. Tank crews, stripped of their machines, were pulled from the city. They slipped out through the harbor, which, against all odds, remained open even as the noose tightened. Morshead's force was small, 14,236 Australians, just under 8,000 British. But they dug in with relentless determination. The old Italian defenses, 30 miles of fortified positions, would become their shield. The plan was austere but effective. Each post would be manned by no more than 10 to 15 men, just enough to hold the line. Behind them, a deadly minefield waited to slow any breakthrough. If the Germans punched through, they wouldn't get far. The mines would stall them, giving Morshead's mobile reserves time to counterattack. Meanwhile, the surrounding outposts would turn their guns inward, cutting the attackers down from the flanks. Rommel assumed Tobruk would be an easy kill. With British forces in full retreat, the port had to be vulnerable. On the night of April 10th through 11th, Rommel launched his first assault. It was reckless, piecemeal. His forces smashed against the defenses and were hurled back, bloodied and broken. The defenders had spent every available moment reinforcing the old Italian fortifications. They had plenty of ammunition, much of it captured from the Italians, and their supply lines still held. Rommel, though never one to retreat from a challenge, spent a day surveying the battlefield himself. On April the 14th, he gathered his panzers for a concentrated, crushing assault, the kind that had shattered France. The German tanks punched a hole in the perimeter, but it was a trap. Artillery and flanking fire erupted from both sides, ripping into the exposed panzers before they could exploit the breach. Morshead's plan had worked to perfection. The Germans fell back, leaving 17 destroyed tanks, 150 dead, and 250 prisoners in the sand. For the very first time since 1939, this seemingly invincible German army had been stopped cold. Morshead refused to let Tobruk become a passive siege. His men struck out nightly, raiding enemy positions, sowing chaos. In just 10 days, they had taken 1,700 prisoners. On April 29th, Rommel attacked again, but the Australians saw it coming. Their guns were loaded and their tanks positioned. They were ready. This time the prize was Ras El Medour, Hill 209, a key high ground overlooking the battlefield. Rommel adjusted. He attacked on a broader front, trying to stretch the defenders too thin to lay down effective flanking fire. But a broad assault meant diluted strength. This was not the same crushing armored thrust that had brought him victory before. British tanks and artillery roared, shredding the German advance. A few outposts fell, but the Germans couldn't push beyond them. the battlefield twisted into a grinding stalemate. The salient, as it came to be called, became the bitter heart of the fight for Tobruk. Rommel had thrown his best at Tobruk, and it had held. He withdrew, reevaluating his next move. Rommel repositioned his Italian divisions to maintain the siege, while his battle-worn Germans withdrew to refit for another assault. But his problem was clear. He didn't have enough men to both take Tobruk and hold the Egyptian frontier. British Brigadier Gott made sure Rommel never knew peace. From Halfaya Pass, his raiders struck again and again, hitting Axis supply lines and outposts. Inside Tobruk, the Australians were just as relentless. They raided nightly, storming enemy positions and keeping the Germans and Italians off balance. For months, Rommel could do nothing but hold his siege lines and fend off British attacks at Halfaya Pass. He was stuck, and his momentum stalled. General Jewell tried to break the deadlock. On May 15th, British forces struck at Halfaya Pass, launching an armored flanking maneuver. It collapsed under stiff German resistance. A month later, Jewell tried again, Operation Battle Axe, an all-out assault, crashed against the German defenses. The new British Crusader tanks burned in the desert, shattered before they could make a difference. These two defeats sealed Jewell's fate. London removed him, placing General Sir Claude Auchinleck in command. Churchill wasn't about to let North Africa slip away. He funneled men, tanks, and supplies into Egypt, bypassing the deadly U-boat-infested Mediterranean when necessary. The 8th Army was forming, and it would be ready. British air support grew stronger. Fighters and bombers patrolled the skies over Egypt and Tobruk, striking at Axis positions and keeping the defenders supplied. Then came Hitler's greatest distraction, Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, Germany hurled its armies into the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front devoured men and resources, and Rommel's Afrika Korps began to feel the strain. Supplies slowed. Reinforcements all but dried up. The tide was shifting. November arrived, and Churchill had waited long enough. Auchinleck launched Operation Crusader, a full-scale offensive to shatter the siege of Tobruk. On November 18th, British tanks and infantry stormed into Cyrenaica. Rain and storms had grounded the Luftwaffe, and Rommel had no warning. His forward positions were hit before he even realized an attack had begun. The battle twisted into chaos. British forces surged through the gaps in the German lines. German counterattacks punched holes in the British advance. Both sides seized whatever fuel and supplies they could, using their enemies' own stockpiles against them. As the British closed in on Tobruk, Rommel did what he did best. He gambled. He struck deep, sweeping around the British flank, aiming to sever their supply lines and trap them against the coast. If it worked, the British force would be gutted. And for a moment, it seemed Rommel would pull off another masterpiece. But the British held firm. The trap never closed, and by December 5th, Rommel was in retreat. He pulled back past Tobruk to Gazala, 25 miles west, and the siege was over. By late summer, the Australians in Tobruk were reaching their breaking point. Disease spread through the ranks. Exhaustion took its toll. Prime Minister John Curtin demanded that his men be withdrawn, not reinforced, but replaced. Slowly, the Australians rotated out, their places taken by fresh troops. By October, only one battalion remained, trapped by relentless German airstrikes, hammering its evacuation convoy. The cost had been brutal. The Australian 9th Division counted 749 dead, 1,996 wounded, and 604 captured. They had held Tobruk, but they had paid for every day of defiance. Axis casualties are impossible to calculate precisely. Rommel had shuffled his forces constantly, throwing them from Tobruk to the Egyptian frontier and back again, bleeding them further in Operation Crusader. But there's no doubt he had suffered. Rommel retreated to the Gazala Line, a network of defensive positions first dug by Indian troops at the war's outset. Here, he would make his next stand. But the British kept coming. One assault after another pushed Rommel back. He abandoned Benghazi, fell back along the coastal road, and by January 1942, he had retreated all the way to El Agheila. The same pattern played out yet again. An army that surged forward now found itself outstretched, worn thin, and pushed into retreat. Rommel struck back. On January 21st, he launched a feint toward Gazala, but it was deception. His real target was Benghazi, and the British saw it too late. The 7th Indian Brigade withdrew in a storm, and Rommel seized the city without a single shot fired. By early February, the cycle had begun again. Rommel's forces surged eastward, Tobruk in their sights once more. This time, he would not be denied. Rommel struck Tobruk hard and fast, taking the city in the kind of swift, decisive assault he had wanted all along. The city was vulnerable. British High Command had drained its defenses for their last offensive. The South African, Indian, and British troops left behind were under-equipped, unprepared, and Tobruk fell swiftly. But in the grand scheme, it was too late. Churchill called it a disgrace, but those were just words. In reality, Tobruk's 242-day stand had done exactly what it needed to do. It had saved Egypt. It may have well saved the Middle East itself. When Morshead first stood on those defenses, Wavell made it clear, quote, "There is nothing between you and Cairo," end quote. And what lay beyond Cairo? Firkins writes, quote, "The Germans would drive like an arrow from Cairo across Arabia to the Persian Gulf and seize the fountainhead of Britain's oil supplies. They would be able to turn north from there and attack Russia from the south as well as the west. India would be menaced. They could link up with the Italians in Ethiopia and invade East Africa. The whole structure of Britain's imperial power could collapse as though its keystone had been knocked away. And Germany would, in fact, and at last, be invincible," end quote. Whether Hitler would have had the patience to wait is debatable, but the danger was real and the cost of failure beyond imagining. Tobruk's defenders had held just long enough. Rommel's drive into Egypt was stalled, and with it, the Axis advance into North Africa. By the time Tobruk finally fell, Hitler's war machine had bigger concerns. The Soviet Union was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. The supplies, the reinforcements, the sheer willpower needed to dominate North Africa had been spent elsewhere. In Tobruk, they were not the largest army, they were not the best equipped. They fought with borrowed weapons, in trenches first dug by their enemies, against an adversary that had swept aside every force before them. But for 242 days, they held. Australians, Britons, Indians, ordinary soldiers who refused to break. Without them, Rommel's panzers would have surged into Egypt. The Suez would have fallen. The oil fields of the Middle East, lifeblood of an empire, would have been handed to Hitler. From there, the Reich could have reached across Arabia, linked with the Japanese in Burma, and set its sights on India itself. The world would have changed, but it did not. Because in that lonely desert fortress, a handful of men stood against the storm and did not fall.